In the autumn of 1918, as the empire for which they had fought was collapsing around them, weary soldiers of the Habsburg Imperial and Royal Army made their way back to their homelands. For some of the higher Habsburg officers, however, the dissolution of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire created a unique dilemma. Some of them had spent so many years as servants of the emperor and had grown so accustomed to the international flavor of the Habsburg military life that they have found difficult to switch their loyalty to any of the new nation-states that were arising from the ruins of the old empire. In the days after the armistice, these disoriented men, for whom the future seemed particularly bleak and uncharted, gravitated to Vienna, there to pay their final tribute to Karl, the last reigning ruler of the 600-year-old dynasty. One of these men, who appeared in Vienna for his last audience with the emperor, was none other than the Rear Admiral Miklos Horthy, the commander-in-chief of the Habsburg Navy. During his last audience with the emperor, Miklos Horthy, trembling and with tears in his eyes, vowed that "I will never rest until I have restored your majesty to his throne in Vienna and Budapest." Who, however, was this 50-year-old admiral called Miklos Horthy? Where did he come from, and did he eventually fulfill his promise to the emperor? Well, let's find out. But before we do, this video is part of a greater HistoryTuber collaboration called Project Dictator, where multiple HistoryTubers talk about the history behind various people that have been called dictators or tyrants or similar in the past. If you want to see all those videos, head on to the Project Dictator playlist, link in the top right corner, description and pinned comment. Miklos Horthy was born in 1868 to low nobility in the Hungarian town of Kenderes. His father was a member of the Hungarian parliament, and overall, his family, even though low nobility, wasn't poor by any means, and controlled around a 610-hectare estate. Miklos Horthy was not neglected by his parents, but he was one of 8 children, and in such an environment, his parents' attention was often divided. This, combined with Horthy's desire for adventure, meant that at his own behest, Horthy was sent to multiple boarding schools, first in Debrecen and later in Sopron. When Horthy was 14, his older brother was accidentally killed during a naval exercise in the Royal Naval Academy. After this unfortunate accident, Horthy decided that he wanted to follow in his late brother's footsteps and enrolled in the Imperial and Royal Naval Academy in today's Rijeka. Here, just like in his previous schools at Debrecen and Sopron, Horthy showed average ability on almost all his subjects but one, languages. He seemed to have a knack for learning new languages and quickly, on top of already knowing French, German and Hungarian, picked up full fluency in Italian and Croatian. Once he graduated and officially joined the Navy, Horthy would also learn a sundry of other languages, most notably English, which he learned while stationed in Pola. His English teacher in Pola was, at the time, an unknown poor writer called James Joyce. While stationed in Pola, Horthy also learned how to sing and play the piano, thanks in part to the local Royal Navy band leader Franz Lehár. Horthy seemed quite content with his place in the Navy and very much enjoyed the opportunities the Navy provided, especially the ability to see the world and meet new people. He traveled as a naval liaison to far-flung places like the Ottoman Empire, New Zealand, India, Borneo, Portugal, England, etc. Everywhere he went, he was always enthusiastically welcomed by the local high society, not only because of his language and conversation skills and his reputation as a perfect Victorian gentleman, but also because of his dancing, music, and athletic skills. He was an avid fencer, equestrian, and a tennis player. During his travels, Horthy also developed great admiration for the British Royal Navy, stating, "The proud saying, 'Britannia rules the waves,' prevailed." We have seen many profound examples of this throughout our journey. Due to Horthy's experience abroad, his excellent language and social skills, and his competence when it came to actual naval command, he steadily climbed up the career pole in the Royal Navy, most notably becoming the naval advisor to the Emperor Franz Joseph in 1909 at the age of 41. It was here in Vienna where Horthy was introduced to the inner workings of the empire and formulated many of his conservative monarchist political ideas. Vienna during that time was apparently the place to be, as not just Horthy and Franz Joseph lived in Vienna, but also Hitler, Tito, Stalin, Trotsky, Freud, and many others. If you want to know more, I made a video about it. When the Great War started, Horthy, now 46, was a commander of SMS Habsburg, but this was only the beginning. One historian describes Horthy's rise through the ranks during the 4-year period of the Great War as meteoric. He proved his naval skills early on during several naval encounters in the Adriatic Sea, and on top of being given a myriad of Austro-Hungarian military awards, he was even awarded the German Iron Cross both first and second class in 1915 due to his successful efforts of escorting German U-boats through an Entente blockade. In 1917, he planned, led, and successfully executed an entire operation which resulted in the largest World War I naval battle in the Adriatic Sea, the Battle of the Otranto Strait. During the battle, Horthy was outnumbered and wounded, but continued to issue orders for hours until he eventually collapsed from blood loss. He was praised throughout the empire as a war hero, especially by Hungarians who viewed him as the most notable Magyar of the Great War. Due to all this, Horthy was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Habsburg Navy in 1918. This new command would not last long, as sadly for Horthy, the war ended with the breaking up of the empire into a myriad of national components. Horthy would later recall that surrendering the Habsburg Navy to the Entente, along with all the other events that occurred in Central Europe after the war, were one of the saddest moments of his life. The empire he served his entire life was destroyed, and the country which he was supposed to call home was beset by enemies on all sides ready to divide its territory. Horthy, however, was not a politician, and after his last meeting with the emperor, returned to his family estate in Kenderes, where, as Thomas Sackminster puts it, he no doubt hoped to spend his remaining years as a country squire, far removed from the political machinations of Budapest and Vienna. But fate had other plans. In early 1919, the Hungarian government resigned in protest against the Entente demands. The ensuing power vacuum was exploited by the Hungarian communists who seized power and established the Hungarian Soviet Republic. With the rise of Hungarian communism, Horthy suddenly became directly affected by the politics he hoped to avoid. The establishment of the Hungarian Soviet Republic was, for Horthy, like a bad dream. He and many of his fellow landholders of the old aristocracy suddenly became targets of the communist government, and his brother was even briefly imprisoned in Budapest. The peasants in the Kenderes area were on multiple occasions urged by the communists arriving from Budapest to seize the estates and manor houses of the local nobility and rise up against their oppressors, including Horthy and his family. We do not have any details of what exactly might have happened in Kenderes during this time, or how much was Horthy and his family affected by some radicalized peasants swept up in the communist fervor. However, it is safe to assume that some confrontations between the peasants and the landowners did occur during this time in Kenderes. The rise of the Hungarian Soviet Republic also brought about a rise in targeted executions and acts of terrorism against people deemed as enemies of communism. These killings and terrorist acts became to be known in Hungary as the Red Terror. The antagonism of his own peasants, combined with the Red Terror sweeping across the country, made Horthy despise the communists and everything they stood for. It was also at this time that Horthy, along with many other counter-revolutionaries, came to formulate quite strong anti-Semitic ideas, mostly spurred on by the fact that a lot of the Hungarian communists happened to be of Jewish origin. For example, the leader of the Soviet Republic, Bela Kun, and 20 of his 26 commissars were all of Jewish origin. The exact reasons for this fairly large involvement of Jews in the Hungarian Soviet Republic are still being debated by historians today, but it is prudent to mention that numbers-wise Jews were still a minority, and most Hungarian communists were ethnic Hungarians. Nonetheless, Horthy, as a believer in old Habsburg monarchist ideas, viewed Bela Kun and his quote, Jewish Soviet Republic as the most dangerous movement ready to destroy the Hungarian way of life. For Horthy, Kun and his government was even more dangerous to Hungary than the neighboring countries taking over Hungarian land. So, when, in the spring of 1919, Horthy, the most notable Hungarian war hero, received a letter from a counter-revolutionary government forming in Szeged if he wanted the command of the newly created national army, Horthy, wanting to put an end to the Hungarian Soviet Republic and maybe reconquer back some of the lost Hungarian lands, enthusiastically accepted accepted this offer and arrived in Szeged 30th of May 1919. During his first cabinet meeting of the counter-revolutionary government, Horthy proclaimed, "I couldn't sit in Kenderes listening to the grass rustling in the wind when my poor fatherland lies in ruins. It has been a difficult inner conflict, but I have come. I accept the responsibility. I am at your command." Horthy's first and only task was to form, organize, and train the National Army. This, unsurprisingly, proved to be a very difficult task with mixed results. Due to the ongoing wars between the Hungarian Soviet Republic, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, Horthy could only muster up men from the local area. For more context on the history of post-war Hungary, watch my Dissolution of Hungary video. As a result of these circumstances, by July, Horthy had only around 5,000 men. However, despite these small numbers, Horthy's story started to circulate throughout the entire country. This story presented a man, a leader, who would often entertain the men in the pub by singing and playing the piano, by sharing anecdotes of far-flung lands he visited, by telling war stories of maritime adventures. Here was a war hero, an aristocrat of the old regime, who, to the common soldiers, seemed like one of them. It did not matter even to the most fervent nationalist that Horthy's Hungarian was, quote, simple, spoken with a German accent, and often intermixed with German or even English words and phrases when Hungarian ones didn't come to mind. That merely added to the international character of this national war hero who clearly spent a long time away from Hungary, but has now come home to liberate it, to raise it to greatness. These early post-war months were the very beginnings of what came to be Horthy's leader cult. However, not all Hungarians saw in him a hero. Many workers living in larger cities viewed Horthy as an old aristocrat who was content with the status quo and therefore will bring no change, no glory, and no prosperity to the struggling country. When it came to the politicians of the counter-revolutionary government who invited Horthy to lead the army, they saw in him nothing more than a military figurehead whose popularity could be used to form an army and establish a new government. They certainly did not expect Horthy to meddle in the political side of the counter-revolution, and initially they were right. Horthy seemed to have been very apathetic towards politics and often just quietly did his duties as the commander of the national army. This national army during the summer of 1919 began to attract ever more radicalized right-wing extremists. Many of the men joining the army were Hungarians driven from their homes by either Hungarian communists or hostile governments of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. These men underwent the radicalizing effects of the refugee experience and held fierce nationalistic, anti-Semitic, anti-communist, militaristic, and irredentist ideas. The most prominent of these right-wing extremists were within the officer corps, people like Gombos, Kozma, Ostenburg, Pronay, etc. These people were also the ones that spent the most time with Horthy as his army advisors and, therefore, could stoke within him ever more radical right-wing beliefs. Horthy wasn't opposed to this and, as stated before, he already fostered his own anti-Semitic, anti-communist and irredentist feelings, but it was in Szeged where he began to be far more radicalized than before. In his own words, "I'm now capable of anything. I'll use strychnine poison and employ the basest methods. After all, our enemies have treated us like corpses to be desecrated." Since Horthy had become quite radicalized at this point, it was not unsurprising that, when his officers like Pronay started to assassinate political opponents and Jews in and around Szeged, he turned a blind eye to all these killings. Even when the politicians in the counter-revolutionary government started to pressure Horthy to stop the killings, Horthy did nothing. In fact, he even praised Pronay and appointed him as his personal bodyguard. Then, in August of 1919, the Hungarian Soviet Republic fell to the Romanian advance and the counter-revolutionary government sprung into action. The national army numbers started to steadily rise and the counter-revolutionary government quickly sent out parts of this growing national army to Western Hungary in order to take control of it. The leaders of this expedition were the radical right-wing officers like Pronay and Miklos Kozma, the latter of which stated that both the red and the pink eras are over. Those who for months have committed heinous crimes must receive their punishment. It is predictable that the compromisers and those with weak stomachs will moan and groan when we line up a few red rogues and terrorists against the walls. Once before, the false slogans of humanism and other isms helped drive the country into ruin. The second time they will wail in vain. Horthy's orders to the departing officers were only given verbally, and there is no record surviving that could tell us what those orders were. However, it is almost certain that Horthy knew the intentions of his officers, and that he himself chose to send these specific men. He was more than aware what these radicalized men were planning to do, and we have to assume that's what he wanted, as in the end, he was the one who sent them. There is even a quote surviving from Horthy's chief of staff, Karoli Soos, who told Pronaj before leaving, "Don't kill too many Jews, since that will create problems too." With their orders in hand and their minds made up, the radical right-wing officers of the National Army went on a campaign of what they called purification in mostly Western Hungary. The majority of the National Army, mostly the lower rank conscripts, did not take part in these heinous crimes and killings of Jews and people who were suspected of having communist sympathies even when there was no proof. But a substantial number of the officer corps of the army did conduct these crimes, which became to be called the White Terror. As Horthy was working on retaking Budapest from the Romanian occupation, newspapers started to publish the stories of the White Terror happening all across Western Hungary. When these reports reached Horthy and the people around him, he did nothing and simply just dismissed the news. Then, when Pronaj returned to Horthy, Horthy told him to continue the excellent job he has been doing. Even when Hungarian politicians and Entente ambassadors started to put ever more pressure on Horthy to stop the White Terror, Horthy still remained silent on the whole issue, hearing out the concerns of the politicians and the Entente ambassadors, but not doing anything about it. There is no evidence to prove or disprove that Horthy ever directly ordered or participated in any of the executions of the White Terror, but he certainly initially did not stop it, or even tried to stop it, despite clearly being aware of it happening. Meanwhile, the political situation in Hungary had gotten complicated. The Szeged government disbanded, a new counter-revolutionary government was founded in Budapest after the communists fled, another counter-revolutionary government was coming from Vienna, and there were multiple local governments and strongmen who exerted control across the occupied lands of Hungary. When the Szeged government fell apart, Horthy found himself at the head of an ever-growing national army, which was now without the government. Despite this, Horthy continued on as normal, as if nothing happened, and was getting his national army ready to retake Budapest after the Romanians were ordered by the Entente to withdraw. This caused a lot of concerns for many Hungarian politicians from the various counter-revolutionary governments. After all, Budapest was the city which, enthusiastically supported the communists, still had many communist sympathizers, and had a large Jewish population. Therefore, many politicians were afraid of what the national army could do in Budapest, considering what they were doing in the countryside. In order to try to prevent any mass killings to happen in Budapest, a group of senior Hungarian statesmen organized a meeting with Horthy to try to plead with him. During the meeting, at the end of a fairly distressing conversation in which Horthy seemed to have continuously refused to address the main issue, one of the statesmen finally lost his temper and asked plainly, "If the National Army enters the capital city, will there be a pogrom, yes or no?" To which Horthy replied, "There will be no pogrom, but a few people will have to take a swim." Despite Horthy's not completely satisfactory answer, the meeting ended on a positive note, as the Hungarian statesmen were happy to hear Horthy say there will be no pogrom. The meeting was also a start to a series of events which slowly led Horthy away from the thinking of his radical right-wing officers. The fact that some of the most senior Hungarian politicians were afraid of what Horthy's army was doing started to open Horthy's eyes to the idea that perhaps the White Terror has gone too far. He even met with the representatives of the Jewish community of Budapest to hear their side of the story before his takeover of the city. By the end of 1919, Horthy still did not completely denounce the work of his officers, and outside of a few pardons which he gave to several Jews and communists captured by his army, he still remained in silent support of the White Terror, but overall he did start a clear slow shift away from the radical right-wing ideas and their proponents. With that said, despite this softening of Horthy, Gombos and other right-wing officers still saw Horthy as a strong leader and the best bet for establishing an authoritative nationalistic state. Therefore, they started to organize a large propaganda campaign, mostly headed by Gombos, to expand the leader cult around Horthy and to promote him as the only viable leader who can save Hungary. Horthy didn't order this propaganda campaign, but he also didn't stop it, and probably at the very least felt flattered that his officers organized it. The National Army marched into Budapest, with Horthy leading it atop a white horse, 16th of November 1919. The pogrom in Budapest that so many were fearing did not happen, as Horthy gave clear instructions to not repeat in Budapest that would happen in ruler Hungary. After taking Budapest, Horthy was advised by many of his radical right-wing officers to establish a military dictatorship and conquer back the lost lands of Hungary. After all, at this point, he was the only man in Hungary with an army, and now even had the capital city in his control. Horthy, however, did not do this. The reasons for why were multiple. First, Horthy still saw himself as a military man, a person who shouldn't play a significant part in politics, and a person who should always be loyal to his king, who, at this point, still had a chance of returning to Hungary. Second, there was almost no chance that the Entente would tolerate an irredentist military dictatorship in Hungary, especially not after what happened with the communists. Therefore, Horthy continued to play the part of an apolitical military leader who would support the establishment of a coalition government. With that said, while playing this part of an apolitical military leader, Horthy did slowly increase his involvement in politics from 1919 to 1920, but largely only in support of other politicians he agreed with rather than as an independent figure. With the capital now back in Hungarian control, the Entente set about establishing a coalition government combining all the various independent counter-revolutionary administrations that sprang up all around Hungary. This coalition government was to oversee an election held in January of 1920. The election was boycotted by the Social Democrats in response to the oppressive actions against the leftist parties during the White Terror, which still continued in the countryside. Due to this, and the overall counter-revolutionary sentiment that spread across Hungary after the fall of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, the government which was elected was overwhelmingly conservative and in favor of restoring the monarchy. The Entente, however, at this point made it very clear that they will not tolerate any return of Habsburg rule in Hungary. This meant that the overwhelmingly monarchist government had to look for a different solution. This different solution came in the form of electing a regent who could preside over the recovery of his country and hold the reins of power until conditions were more propitious for Karl von Habsburg's return. As for who will fill this position of a regent, there was really no question. Sure, there were more senior and higher-ranking nobles in Hungary who could be elected as regents, but Horthy's popularity among the people at this point was unmatched by any other Hungarian. Despite his hand in the White Terror, he seemed to have publicly distanced himself enough from it, while still not actively stopping it, that by 1920 many people viewed Horthy as the most viable candidate despite his checkered past. Not to mention that his radical right-wing officers were still actively working on a propaganda campaign around his leader cult, hoping that Horthy would eventually establish that desired military dictatorship. When it came to the politicians themselves, some had gripes with Horthy, such as his poor skill of the Hungarian language, which was allegedly just as bad as the Hungarian of Franz Joseph, or his poor understanding of statecraft and politics. But for the most part, many still viewed Horthy as a man who could be controlled and didn't have large aspirations for power. After all, he had an opportunity to establish a military dictatorship when he took Budapest, but he didn't. So, when it came to the parliamentary vote to choose a regent, Horthy was elected in a landslide. He, however, did something which many of the politicians did not expect. He refused to take the regency, stating that he cannot accept a position which was gutted of its function by parliament and demanded to have more power as regent, such as the ability to dissolve parliament. The parliament was furious, but they also couldn't realistically deny Horthy's request, as they did just elect him in an overwhelming majority, and Horthy's loyal army officers were currently stationed in Budapest just in case. Whether Horthy actually planned to have the army officers stationed in Budapest as an intimidation tactic, or the officers were acting of their own accord, is hard to say. In any case, Parliament acquiesced to Horthy's demands, who subsequently, on March 1st, 1920, swore an oath to protect the Hungarian people and nation as its regent. Now, as the regent, with increased political power, Horthy could no longer play the card of silence and indifference. He had to choose sides or risk losing his power. Therefore, harkening back to his old, deeply entrenched monarchist roots, Horthy sided with the so-called Old Conservatives, the monarchists of the parliament, and his days of silently supporting the radical right-wing army officers and politicians were coming to an end. This wasn't an overnight change, and it did take more than a year to manifest, but by the end of 1921, the White Terror finally ended, as Horthy withdrew his silent support and even enacted certain laws that would stop it. The exact numbers of the White Terror are impossible to determine, as no real records were kept by the perpetrators, but definitely at least 1,000 people lost their lives, with tens of thousands injured, maimed, and imprisoned. Horthy finally detached themselves from the radical right-wing officers and politicians and started to even support some Jewish and socialist programs, like the governmental financial recovery plan funded by Jewish capital, or the allowing of leftist parties to print their newspapers, which they were forced to stop during the White Terror. Horthy still retained some anti-Semitic prejudice, but no longer was he going to support active eradication and suppression of them. When it came to communism, Horthy also retained a strong anti-communist sentiment for pretty much his entire life, but again, he was also no longer going to support active killing of communists in Hungary. Horthy's former radical right-wing friends were furious with him, accusing him of becoming soft, a Jew-loving aristocrat, a drugged puppet of the Freemasons. They basically became the YouTube comments. In 1923, in opposition to the Old Conservatives, these right-wing radicals formed their own party called the Racial Defense, which from its name you can probably guess what it was about. Thankfully, it never gained much political support, but its ideas remained ever present in Hungarian politics and strongly entrenched in the Hungarian military. Horthy in the early 1920s also had several plans to reconquer primarily Transylvania and Slovakia, but these never went anywhere, as most Hungarian politicians were against any military actions, considering their neighbors had military support from the Entente and Hungary's economic situation was very poor. This is not to say that the Hungarian politicians didn't want to restore original Hungarian borders, they just were hoping to do it diplomatically, through revising the Trianon Treaty, not through yet another war. Plus, Hungary had one more major problem to deal with in 1921, and that was the return of the Habsburg king Karl IV. Horthy was sporadically communicating with Karl during the entire post-war period, and during their communications, he never gave any sign that would suggest he would not give up the throne to Karl if he returned. Plus, Horthy still saw himself as a loyal subject of the emperor, but the roughly 1-year period of Horthy's regency between 1920 and 21 gave Horthy a taste for power, for control, and for being able to do something to help Hungary. Horthy came to increasingly see himself as someone who could help and fix Hungary if only he stayed in power. And so, when Karl unexpectedly came to Hungary to retake his throne, Horthy went through a serious internal crisis. It also didn't help that the Hungarian parliament was at the time also divided between legitimists supporting the return of Karl von Habsburg and the free electors supporting the election of an official Hungarian king, e.g. Horthy. In essence, Karl's arrival in Hungary split both loyalties of the parliament and Horthy's conscience. Karl, however, remained convinced that the old admiral would keep his promise he made to him in 1918. Karl also allegedly secured a verbal promise from the French Prime Minister that France would support Habsburg restoration in Hungary. Armed with the belief that Horthy was going to relinquish power to him and that the French would support him, Karl, without a large entourage nor much planning, suddenly showed up at the Royal Palace in Budapest 27th of March 1921. Horthy was told about Karol only minutes before his arrival and was in vivid turmoil. One of Horthy's bodyguards noticed this and, in the hopes of encouraging the regent, said, "The guard will be faithful until death to the regent. In the name of the Magyar nation, we ask the regent to remain true to the oath he has taken to the nation." Minutes after that, Karol and Horthy were sitting in the main office of the royal palace and what Horthy described as the most difficult moments in my entire life began. Horthy admitted the throne should belong to Karol and that he was still a loyal servant of the emperor, but at the same time, Horthy also believed he was a better choice to lead the Hungarian nation at this specific time, and that if Karol took the throne, Hungary would be occupied on all sides by its neighbors who were supported by the Entente, which already stated it didn't want Habsburg restoration. Despite being a loyal servant of the emperor, Horthy could not let this happen. When Horthy declined to relinquish power, Karol asked, "You would disobey a command of your king?" Horthy, clearly unnerved by this statement, didn't reply, and continued to argue that it was impossible for Karol to take the throne. "There is not even a 0.5% possibility that your majesty will succeed." Brushing these arguments aside, Karol continued to question Horthy's loyalties, but the region would not yield. Finally, to address the region's concern with the Entente, Karol mentioned that he had the support of the French Prime Minister, but he could not prove it, for it was only given to him verbally. Horthy was very skeptical of this and continued to refuse to relinquish power. After an almost 3-hour debate, Horthy concluded with, "Your Majesty, I must choose between my loyalty to the dynasty and to my nation. I choose the nation and will not hand over the government, because in 24 hours this unfortunate country would be occupied and partitioned." With that said, the conversation ended, and a deeply saddened Karol departed the palace. But he did not leave Hungary. The next day, Karol sent a message to Horthy stating, "I demand that you immediately submit yourself to my command. I have no doubt, my dear, faithful admiral, about your response." Horthy responded, "I cannot oppose my king. Pushed into a conflict of conscience, I shall be forced to resign. That is why I ask for the withdrawal of this order." Karol, however, did not withdraw his order, and the regent did not resign. The following days, as the word got out that Karol was back in Hungary, the Entente diplomats in Budapest all reaffirmed they will not support Habsburg restoration in Hungary, and the neighboring countries, confirming Horthy's fears, stated that a return of Habsburg rule would give them a casus belli. The alleged French support for Karol never materialized, and so even the legitimists, seeing that the peaceful restoration of the Habsburg monarchy wouldn't be possible, started to withdraw their support. In the end, Karol had no choice but to leave Hungary in April. Horthy could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but not for long, as Karol returned to Hungary 20th of October that same year, this time hoping to take the throne by military means. This was to be the last hurrah for the remaining Hungarian legitimists, who started off in Sopron and continued to gather supporters on their march to Budapest. Horthy again argued that he couldn't give up the throne, because if he did, Hungary would be destroyed in a war with the Entente and its neighbors. Therefore, he, along with the free electors in the parliament, tried to quickly mobilize the defense of the capital, with Horthy proclaiming he will defend Budapest against "our poor king who has been led astray." Seeing this as a serious military threat, neighboring countries partially mobilized some of their troops, most notably Czechoslovakia, who was poised to exploit the crisis to deal a crushing blow to nationalist and irredentist sentiment in Hungary. The Entente yet again stated their strong opposition to any Habsburg rule in Hungary, while also denouncing the intentions of Czechoslovakia. Karol, seeing that he had no international support and that his restoration could spark not just a civil war in Hungary but also an all-out war with its neighbors, finally gave up. He left Hungary in November for the last time, defeated. The free electors, now in control of the parliament, imposed their will, and in November a law was passed effectively dethroning the Habsburg dynasty from the Hungarian throne. Hungary still remained a kingdom, with a regent, waiting for a king. However, now that the Habsburgs were effectively dethroned, Who was to be this king of Hungary exactly was never determined. This was mainly due to the fact that the old conservative monarchist system, which Horthy and his parliament implemented, and which did not differ much from the system of the old empire, was keeping the status quo and the old aristocracy intact, and so, in turn, the old aristocracy, who was largely in charge, did not mess with the system that kept them in charge. Electing Horthy as an official king might have upset the balance in the country and in Central Europe as a whole, and so the status quo of having a regent, who was effectively the king in all but name, was never changed. Therefore, it wasn't surprising when in 1929 Count Bethlen, the then Prime Minister of Hungary, proclaimed that Horthy would remain in office to the end of his life. Horthy and his old conservative parliament believed that a full democracy would be a disaster, a rule of the mob, and so implemented a system where only 28% of the population, mostly the upper and upper middle class, was eligible to vote. This meant that old conservative parties could remain largely in charge of the parliament during the interwar period, and the aristocracy remained in control of most of the country's land and industry. This system was called by some a semi-feudal order. Horthy himself was also often called having an almost medieval mentality, who often reveled in his leader's cult, which compared him to such medieval Hungarian figures like John Hunyadi. To give an example of Horthy's medieval mentality, during one comedic affair, when in 1936 some Czechoslovak newspapers published some slanderous articles about Hungary, Horthy, to defend his nation's honor, challenged Masaryk, the then president of Czechoslovakia, to a duel. This obviously did not happen, but it goes to show that Horthy was often stuck in his 19th century ways. With all that said, despite Horthy's championing of old conservatism and his dissociation with the right-wing radicals in the early 1920s, the undercurrent of radical right-wing movements never really went away in Hungary. Horthy never actually tried to stomp out the right-wing radicals actively, and on occasions even tolerated their presence, especially in the military, which proved highly problematic by the time of the Second World War. When it came to the late 1930s, Horthy was presented with multiple, all partially unwelcomed opportunities. He was happy seeing the rise of fascism across Europe, which, despite not agreeing with its values fully, he saw as a far more favorable political movement than communism. However, the rise of fascism in his own country and the creation of the Arrow Cross was a highly unwelcomed one. In Horthy's eyes, they were far too radical, far too anti-Semitic, and far too in favor of a military dictatorship which would upend the centuries-old Hungarian semi-feudal order. Horthy also had some gripes when it came to Hitler himself, a man whose vulgarity and histrionic ways were hardly the marks of a true gentleman. Despite all these gripes, Hitler tried to entice Horthy by presenting him with the opportunity to restore the original borders of Hungary. Horthy was extremely pleased with this opportunity, but also extremely cautious. Being an old admiral, he never for a second believed, if a world war was to break out, that Nazi Germany could ever beat Britain and USA, who had much superior navies. He even made this known to Hitler on multiple occasions. Horthy was instead hoping that if Hungary was to restore its original borders, it could do so not just with German support but also with Allied support. This was obviously quickly shot down by both the Allies and Nazi Germany. With Horthy's plan of both German and Allied support for the restoration of Hungarian borders not materializing, Hungary started to be politically pulled apart. Hungarian politics became increasingly divided between German sympathizers, who wanted to use an alliance with Nazi Germany to restore Hungarian borders and defeat the Soviets, and the Hungarian neutralists who, even though also wanting to restore Hungarian borders, believed Nazi Germany was going to lose the inevitable world war and, therefore, wanted to remain neutral, waiting for a more opportune moment for the restoration of Hungarian borders. Of course, there is far more to this divide than just the way Hungarians wanted to restore their original borders. The neutralists, who were mostly the old conservatives, also didn't like the rampant German anti-Semitism and overall preferred closer ties with the West, while the German sympathizers were mostly Hungarian fascists and other right-wing radicals who wanted to implement many Nazi-style laws in Hungary. To the dismay of the Hungarian fascists and the German sympathizers, Horthy sided yet again with the old conservatives and, for much of the pre-war period, pursued a tactic of neutrality. When Nazi Germany was getting ready to invade Czechoslovakia, Hitler told Horthy that if Hungary was to aid in a possible invasion, it could take the whole of Slovakia. Even though, delighted at the prospect of this, Horthy declined the offer, fearing that it would force Hungary into an alliance with the Axis, who would be fighting a losing war against the Allies. Horthy even told the British and American ambassadors in Budapest that Hitler was a madman who was bringing the world to chaos. With all that said, Hungary did gain southern Slovakia thanks to the First Vienna Award, which was a conclusion to the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement was, however, an internationally recognized treaty, and even though largely negotiated by the Germans, Horthy and his neutralist allies made sure to make it clear that Hungary negotiated its part of the agreement alone and not in partnership with the Nazis. In essence, Horthy and the neutralists were using the political situation in Europe to their benefit while keeping the Nazis at arm's length to secure their neutrality. Hungary employed the same tactic of keeping German involvement at arm's length a couple of months later when they annexed Ruthenia during the German invasion of Czechia and the proclamation of independent Slovakia. This was met with greater international opposition than the annexation of southern Slovakia, as it wasn't part of the Munich Agreement, but for the most part, with Germany supporting the action, Hungary did not see much international backlash. Again, just like with southern Slovakia, Hungary could only do this because of the actions of Nazi Germany, but again, Horthy and the neutralists only exploited the political situation which the Nazis created, without actually directly working with the Nazis and sometimes even opposing them. This opposition can, for example, be seen when the Nazis asked if Hungary was to help them invade Poland or at least let German troops travel through Hungary, to which Horthy allegedly replied he would rather blow up his own rail lines than let the Germans use them. All this political maneuvering of Horthy and the neutralists, of trying to keep Hungary neutral while exploiting the situation, was becoming ever more controversial in Hungary. Sure, Hungary did gain some land, but that paled in comparison to what it could have gotten if it just cooperated with Germany fully, and due to this, the Hungarian fascists and the German sympathizers were gaining ever more power. Plus, after the German victory in Poland, and later in Western Europe, even some of the neutralists started to doubt the neutrality stands Hungary had taken. Then, when Romania was weakened due to being forced to cede Bessarabia to the Soviets, the largely fascist army officers in Hungary started to pressure Horthy and the neutralists to take Transylvania, for now was the time. Romania was weak. They even began to prepare the Hungarian army for an attack. This entire situation made Hitler furious. He could not allow Hungary to instigate a conflict with Romania, who he viewed as a valuable ally for a future attack on the USSR. Therefore, he offered to arbitrate the whole situation. Subsequently, the Second Vienna Award occurred and Romania was forced to give up northern Transylvania in order to appease Hungary. Yet again, were the Hungarian fascists and German sympathizers proven correct? If only Hungary was to just work directly with Germany, it could gain so much more. This affair also showed that Horthy was losing control over his ever-growing radicalized army, which was the main instigator of this entire clash. All these events came to a head in 1941 when Hitler effectively manipulated Horthy. Hitler knew that Horthy, an old admiral, always had dreams of establishing a Hungarian port. So, playing on these dreams, Hitler proposed that if Hungary was to help in conquering Yugoslavia, he would negotiate with the Italians to give Hungary a port in Croatia. Horthy was enthused by this prospect that he could not be stopped even by his neutralist allies from making Hungary partake in this war. The old conservatives pleaded with the regent. They tried to convince him that this was a terrible mistake. After all, he himself believed that Germany would not win this world war. However, Horthy's military staff and other German sympathizers argued that this was finally the chance for Hungary to retake its southern lands, to gain a port. In the end, Horthy could not be stopped from his dreams of acquiring a port for Hungary and so approved Hungarian involvement in the Yugoslav war. This meant that Hungary was to finally go to war alongside Germany. The Hungarian fascists and German sympathizers, despite still being opposed by Horthy, finally got what they wanted and enthusiastically supported the region's decision. The years of neutrality that the neutralists have been trying to cultivate were shattered by the fascists and Horthy's ambition. The Prime Minister of Hungary at the time, Teleki, who was a neutralist staunchly against siding with Germany, stated that, "My situation is extremely difficult, because the regent, the army, half of the government, and the parliamentary majority are against me." He tried everything he could to keep Hungary out of the war, but in the end, he failed. This failure made him go into deep depression. He could not bear to see his country go into yet another world war alongside Germany, which he believed couldn't be trusted. Due to this, he committed suicide right before the invasion of Yugoslavia. His suicide note read, "We have become the breakers of our word. Out of cowardice, in defiance of the treaty of eternal friendship based on the Mohács speech, the nation feels this, and we have thrown away its honor. We have placed ourselves on the side of scoundrels, for there is no word of truth in the stories of atrocities against the Magyars or Germans in Yugoslavia. We shall become the despoilers of corpses, the most abominable of nations. I did not restrain you, Hungary. I am guilty." Horthy was shaken by Teleki's suicide, but nonetheless still believed he made the right decision. After the successful invasion of Yugoslavia, Hungary did gain some territory from the campaign, but by far not as much as Horthy was hoping. It was partially due to this that, when the German invasion of USSR began, Horthy initially did not support it and did not declare war on the USSR. But the fascist movement in Hungary was too strong at this point, and the new fascist prime minister, László Bardossy, along with the fascists in the military, convinced Horthy that it would be in Hungary's best interest to declare war against the USSR. Convincing Horthy of this actually wasn't very hard, as he was a staunch anti-communist since the time of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, and Bardossy presented the war to the region as an old crusade against Bolshevism, which Horthy very much liked the sound of. And so, Hungary was going to war alongside Nazi Germany again. Win or lose, Hungary's fate was now unquestionably tied to that of Nazi Germany. Even though the fate of Hungary was now tied to Nazi Germany, Horthy still seemed to have, in the back of his mind, believed in the superiority of the Allied navy. Britain had broken off diplomatic relations with Hungary at this point, but America had not, as it wasn't in the war yet, and Horthy invited the American ambassador in 1941 for friendly meals during which he would talk to him about the Anglo-Saxon powers and their navy and industry. Horthy's praise of the Anglo-Saxon powers, while being at war with some of them, goes to show just how much Hungary, and Horthy himself, was politically divided. Horthy still seemed to have garnered some sympathies for the Western Allies. On the other hand, Horthy could not ignore the very strong fascist movement in Hungary or the fact that Hungary was in no position to oppose Nazi Germany. If Hungary didn't go to war willingly with Nazi Germany, it would certainly be forced to go. On top of that, Horthy viewed the war with the USSR as separate from the war with the Western powers. In his eyes, the war against the Soviet Union should have been supported by the West, as he was fighting against the power that intends to destroy civilization. In contrast to that, the war with the Western powers, which later also included the US, was a misunderstanding that he hoped could be solved with some sort of a compromise peace. Therefore, when Hungary, in accordance with Nazi Germany, declared war on the US in December of 1941, Horthy was absolutely devastated and furious, for he did not approve this declaration of war, and it was solely done by the Prime Minister Bardossy. Before the departure of the US Embassy from Hungary, Horthy's son, István, expressed the sympathy for the Allies that both he and his father felt. With all that said, the initial victories of Germany against the Allies made even Horthy start to doubt his own belief in the Anglo-Saxon powers and made him, weirdly, for a brief moment, hold contradicting beliefs in both Axis and Western Allied victory. When it came to the Jewish question during this time, Hungary was yet again strongly divided. The old conservatives, along with Horthy, even though holding some anti-Semitic views themselves, were not willing to implement the extremely harsh anti-Jewish laws of the fascists. Ironically, the Hungarian upper house, the Hungarian version of the House of Lords, which was criticized for keeping the semi-feudal order of Hungary intact during the interwar period, now thwarted the enactment of harsh anti-Semitic laws by the right-wing anti-Semites Semites in the Hungarian lower house. All of this is not to say that the parliament did not implement anti-Semitic laws during this time. It definitely did. For example, Hungarians deported some Jews to Nazi Germany who did not have Hungarian citizenship. They forcibly relocated or even killed some Jews living in newly conquered border areas to strengthen the area's ethnic makeup, and they confiscated some Jewish property, etc. But they also protected most Hungarian Jews from being deported to Nazi Germany, or being used as forced laborers, or being killed just for being Jewish. Most of these legislations, both good and bad, were either signed off by Horthy or not suspensory vetoed by him. This quote by Horthy perhaps best summarizes his views on the situation and the overall sentiment of the old conservatives towards the Jews. I have perhaps been the first to loudly profess anti-Semitism, yet I cannot look with indifference at the inhumanity and senseless humiliations when we still need them. Moreover, I consider, for example, the Arrow Cross men and other right-wing radicals to be by far more dangerous and worthless for my country than I do the Jew. The latter is tied to his country from self-interest, and is more faithful to his adopted country than the Arrow Cross men, who, with their muddled brains, want to play the country into the hands of the Germans. Also during this time, while the war was going well, Horthy, after having a couple of health scares at the age of 74, started to worry about the succession of the regency. He was convinced that the next regent should be his eldest son, István Horthy, who he viewed as a genius. It was true that his son was very knowledgeable and had extensive managerial skills, but he also lacked any political or military skills, plus he was viewed by a lot of Hungarian politicians as a quote, liberal playboy, who was the worst of both worlds. The old conservatives viewed him as too liberal and too willing to enact certain social reforms. The socialists saw him as a conservative aristocrat. The fascists viewed him as too socialist, and, worst of all, he held no anti-Semitic views, which was unacceptable in an age of rampant anti-Semitism. Despite all this, Horthy did manage to get his son elected in 1942 with few caveats as a deputy regent, so for a brief moment the succession question seemed to have been resolved, but that same year István would sadly die on the Eastern Front. After István's death, Horthy's second eldest son, Miklós Horthy Jr., became the next candidate for the deputy regent position, but considering the now ever worsening state on the Eastern Front, more pressing matters had to be attended to first. As the war started to turn against Germany, and in doing so also against Hungary, Horthy's belief in the Anglo-Saxon powers and his disdain for Nazi Germany and Hitler returned in full force. Horthy quickly allied himself with the neutralists once again and started trying to regain some favor with the Allies by beginning secret peace talks with them. He, however, made sure to exclude the Soviet Union from these talks. Horthy, along with all the other Hungarian politicians, feared that if the USSR gained control of post-war Hungary, that was bound to mean the end of Hungary, for it was quite natural that as a drop in the ocean of Bolshevik and Slav peoples, the Hungarian identity would disappear. Therefore, Horthy tried his utmost to gain whatever favor he could with the West, primarily Britain and the USA. Britain and the US, with their preparation for D-Day, put pressure on Hungary to rebel against German control and in doing so divert German resources. The Allies insisted that Hungary should immediately follow Italy's example, i.e. jump out, shouldering the risks. If Hungary failed to draw the consequences of this situation, it would mean that it was once more siding with the Germans. It would thereby forever lose her chance of being handled differently from Germany by the victors. Hungary should take this step even at the risk of temporary German occupation. When Horthy, along with his politicians, voiced concerns of the possible ramifications of German invasion, the destruction of Hungarian democratic elements, and Europe's last intact Jewish community, the Allied negotiators replied, "There is a war on. We are up to our necks in blood. A few 100,000 lives here and there will not make a difference." All these negotiations were caught by the German Secret Service, and in order to keep Hungary loyal and in the war, Hitler invaded Hungary March of 1944. Hungary did not fight back against the Germans, as many Hungarian fascists welcomed the regime change, and Horthy knew that Hungary had no chance of defeating the German army, so he didn't try to fight it. Horthy also came to a tenuous agreement with Hitler where he will still remain in power, even if as a figurehead for the Germans. Horthy justified his logic of staying in power even when controlled by Germany thusly. I cannot let an usurper sit in this place. I have sworn to the country not to forsake it. I'm still an admiral. The captain cannot leave his sinking ship. He must remain on the bridge to the end. Whom will it serve if Imredi sits here? Who will defend the army? Who will save the million Magyar lads from being dragged away to the Russian shambles? Who will defend the honorable men and women in this country who had trusted me blindly? Who will defend the Jew or our refugees if I leave my post? I may not be able to defend everything, but I believe that I can still be of great, very great help to our people. I can do more than anyone else. Horthy seemed to have stayed true to these words and tried to fight the best he could the Hungarian fascists, the Jewish deportations, and the German control over the country. At one point, when Romania withdrew from the Axis in August of 1944, Horthy seized on the opportunity of a weakened Eastern Front and tried to retake control of the Hungarian government and also quickly signed an armistice treaty with the Soviets. This brief regaining of control over his country by Horthy lasted only until October, when the Nazis, who anticipated this move by Horthy, imprisoned him with the help of the Hungarian fascists and afterwards forced him to revert the armistice treaty with the Soviets and abdicate in favor of the Arrow Cross. Horthy was then, on October 17, taken to the Western train station in Budapest along with his family and forced to board a train to Germany, where he would remain a prisoner for the rest of the war. The train which took Horthy to Germany in 1944 took the same path in the opposite direction as the train which took Horthy from Vienna to his home in Kenderes in 1918. That October 1917, 1944 was to be the last time Horthy would ever see Hungary, for even though he survived until 1957, mostly living in Portugal, he was never allowed to return to Hungary because the post-war communist government established in Hungary viewed him as the incarnation of the evil against which progressive people everywhere had to fight. Well, that was a long video. Don't forget this video is part of a greater collaboration called Project Dictator, where various history YouTubers made videos on various topics on dictators or on people who had been called dictators and shouldn't have, etc. Basically, we went with the most broadest definition of the word dictator and what kind of a video we can make about it. So if you want to see any of those videos, click on the playlist link in the top right corner or the description or the pinned comment. Hopefully you enjoyed the really long video this time around. However, don't always expect this. This length of a video is more of an exception for me. Let's see how it's going to do. Hopefully well. Hopefully this video is also monetized because I spent so much time and money working on it. If it's not monetized, maybe please consider supporting me on Patreon. Even if it's monetized, maybe please consider supporting me on Patreon. It is great help. With that said, thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Without them, these videos wouldn't be possible. And special thanks to this month's Deity tier patron, Daniel Garza. My name is Mlazer, and as always, stick around for history.